Good morning, everybody. As what just said, we're going to be reading something about God's wonderful love and how He takes care of us even when things are hard for us. We're reading Habakkuk chapter 1, verses 1 to 11. The oracle that Habakkuk the prophet received. How long, O Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? Or cry out to you violence, but you do not save? Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrong? Destruction and violence are before me. There is strife and conflict abounds. Therefore the law is paralyzed and justice never prevails. The wicked hem in the righteous so that justice is perverted. Look at the nations and watch, and be utterly amazed. For I am going to do something in your days that you would not believe, even if you were told. I am raising up the Babylonians, that ruthless and impetuous people who sweep across the whole earth to seize dwelling places not their own. They are a feared and dreaded people. They are a law to themselves and promote their own honor. Their horses are swifter than leopards, fiercer than wolves at dusk. Their cavalry gallops headlong. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like a vulture swooping to devour. They all come bent on violence. Their hordes advance like a desert wind and gather prisoners like sand. They deride kings and scoff at rulers. They laugh at all fortified cities. They build earthen ramps and capture them. Then they sweep past like the wind and go on. Guilty men whose own strength is their God.
Over the last several months in the news, we have heard many stories that have just had our heads shaking. We've heard stories of terrorism as people armed with weapons, whether it's guns or even knives and machetes, have attacked innocent civilians. We've heard stories of policemen abusing their power and ultimately taking the life of people they were supposed to be protecting. We've heard stories of just incredible violence and getting into conversations with people. The question that just keeps coming up for so many people is, why? Why is God allowing this to happen? What we want to do this morning is we want to look at one of the, it's always funny when you talk about the minor prophets because that suggests that in some way they are less important. And the only reason they're called the minor prophets is because there are 12 books that are called the minor prophets because those are shorter books. And actually in the Hebrew Bible, they're all collected together in one book called the Book of the 12. But they are people who had messages that were critically important for their time, as any prophet would. And the prophet Habakkuk shares, to me, kind of a heritage with Old Testament people like Job, who in some way wrestled with the issues of their lives and of their world and with God, and asked very difficult questions. We don't have time to take a look at the book of Job this morning, but Habakkuk is one that I always find to be very fascinating, Because he lived at a time the northern tribe of Israel has been taken off into captivity. They've been literally destroyed. And the southern kingdom of Judah has been led by a series of kings, with Josiah being one of the exceptions. And these kings have allowed idolatry and immorality and a corrupt, just a totally corrupt society. And so for people like Habakkuk that are concerned about God and concerned about his word, and concerned about what it is to live as a decent, moral, righteous person, they wonder. And so this short little 3 chapters, and we're going to be talking about the whole book, and I'm going to encourage you, I'll give you your homework to start with, right? That when you get home, read through all 3 chapters. It's a fascinating book. But it begins with Habakkuk, and it kind of takes the format of there are a couple of complaints that Habakkuk makes. In a way, you kind of see that he asks God, why? And that kind of, and so chapter 1, he comes to the horrible conditions that are part of the culture, the life in Jerusalem and Judah. And he points out, if you noticed in the reading, I cry to you violence. He speaks of the injustice, the wrong, the strife, the conflict. He's not talking about what's going on outside. These are supposed to be God's covenant people. This is supposed to be a nation led by God. And words that sound like they could have been written today. The law is paralyzed. Justice fails. You think about the police officers who killed the guy down in the States? That what is supposed to be right has become wrong. And so where do you turn to? Who do you look to? And for Habakkuk, the question is, God, why are you allowing this to happen? Justice is perverted. What's going on? It's really interesting to kind of look at this from Habakkuk's standpoint because, like Job, he's asking questions of God and he's expecting an answer. In fact, with the second complaint, he actually, like Job, is going to say, I'm going to sit back and see what God says. But with this first one, God replies, and I want you to kind of imagine Habakkuk's position here, because as he is looking at this and really frustrated, and he's pouring out his heart to God about all that's going wrong, and he's just so troubled that God's answer to him basically is, don't worry about it, I'm going to handle it. So what God says is, I'm about to do something that's just absolutely amazing. You would never even have thought it possible. I'm going to raise up the Babylonians. The older translations will render this the Chaldeans. I'm going to raise up the Babylonians and have them come in and deal with it. Now, I want you to imagine for a second here this idea of where Habakkuk is here. Because first there's this sense that, okay, God says, I'm going to deal with it. Okay, good. And then he says, I'm going to bring the Babylonians, Chaldeans, down in. And Habakkuk has a bigger problem. That's his second complaint. Why? Now, to understand this, imagine that you have a neighbor next door that is really noisy and loud. Okay? And you complain to the authorities about it, and they say, okay, we're going to move that person out, and we're going to move a drug dealer in next instead. Or we're going to move a gang into that house next door. You're thinking, You know, the expression we use is, you know, out of the frying pan into the fire. Only, you know, like the second situation is worse than the first. How is that a solution? You're going to get rid of the bad leadership in Judah and Jerusalem, and you're going to replace it with a heathen nation from the other side of the world that is nothing but violent and corrupt and evil. And Habakkuk's question is like, how is that an improvement? How does that deal? You know, and he says, God, you are too pure to look at evil. You know, in other words, Habakkuk is going to his basic understanding of who God, what is God? Well, God is holy, God is righteous, God is justice. How can you possibly tolerate the Babylonians? How can you allow the wicked to swallow up those who are more righteous? You know, this solution, you know, to Habakkuk, this is just not a possibility. You know, it just can't figure out a way for this to possibly work. And so God answers him, says, okay, I want you to write this down. We have different expressions, you know. When God says, yeah, I want you to write this down so it can be published, you know, and spread about. You know, we say things, so I want you to take this to the bank. This is something that you can count on is going to happen. And God says, okay, for the Babylonians, their arrogance will be their downfall. Their success will be the cause of their ruin. And ultimately, they will fall and experience failure. In other words, that God is basically pointing out to Habakkuk is, okay, look, yes, I'm first going to be dealing with the king in Jerusalem and the judges and the leaders who are so corrupt and immoral and indecent. And I'm going to use the Babylonians to punish them, but then I'm going to deal with the Babylonians. That the fact that the Babylonians are coming in is only a temporary step in my overall plan. And so in talking about the Babylonians, now, there's a series of woes that God speaks about them. Woe to him who tries to gain by evil and wrong. That's kind of a paraphrase of what it says, but you know, that's really the summation of what the Babylonians were about. They were sweeping around, driving out nations before, taking captives, stealing treasure, building an empire out of cruelty and violence. Woe to those who plot the ruin of others. Woe to he who builds through bloodshed and injustice, who takes advantage of others, and who builds and worships false gods. You know, God wants Habakkuk to understand that his use of the Babylonians in no way indicates approval of them. In fact, they are under, you know, if you look at this, they are under the severest form of condemnation, you know, in the eyes of God. The fact that he's using them to deal with the sin in Judah is using both, really, when you think about it. He's got to deal with the false leaders of his people. And he's got to deal with this idolatrous, evil nation. So he's assuring Habakkuk that he is still in control, that he is still sovereign, Now, there are some memorable verses in these 3 chapters, but we're going to notice 3 here in chapter 2. The first is the righteous will live by his faith or faithfulness. And if you think about that, this verse is quoted 3 times in the New Testament. Paul uses it in Romans. And this is kind of a lesson, actually, to Habakkuk. Somebody writing about Habakkuk and commenting on him as he's kind of at the beginning of this prophecy. And Habakkuk has a faith in God, but it's very simple. It's very shallow. It has a lot of his own expectations of how things are supposed to be. And therefore, it's very fragile. Because if things don't happen, and that's one of the dangers that we have as God's people, is that we try to tell God and we try to figure out how God should deal with the issues in the world and the issues in our lives. And we try to write the script for him. When things don't work out the way that we want them to, we get frustrated and disappointed and discouraged. And the lesson to Habakkuk is here, hold on, you need to live by faith. And what that means is trusting that God is sovereign and in control. And he doesn't need you as his counselor. And unfortunately, I heard somebody say this years ago, and I often thought is that it's true, is that God runs the universe and he doesn't need my help. But yet we always think we can do that. But in verse 14 he says, the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord. See, what is God working toward? Not helping the Babylonians to build a greater empire, but rather so that the whole world, those who know him and all of the pagan nations and empires as well, will realize that Yahweh is ultimately sovereign. So you kind of think about it, it's a very simple little, almost an equation, that if the Babylonians come down and defeat the people of Judah, then that means that the Babylonians are more powerful. But if God defeats the Babylonians, then who's more powerful? Who is the sovereign? God is working for a greater purpose. And then verse 20, Tim led the song right before. It's funny, many people think that the words of that song come from the book of Psalms. It comes from the book of Habakkuk. The Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth be silent before him. All of the nations, all of the powers, all of the empires are subject to him. He is sovereign. And his assurance, or reassurance to Habakkuk is that God is about to demonstrate who he is and what place he has over all of the nations. Yes, what's happening in Judah is gut-wrenching. And the thought of Judah being defeated by a pagan nation could be faith-shaking. But for God to come out standing over all of the nations in his majesty and his sovereignty to be known. So, answering why, his point really is to say to Habakkuk that your understanding, or his understanding, is limited by his weak and uncertain faith. You expect certain circumstances and outcomes to happen. See, in other words, you're expecting God to perform and respond the way you want him to and you expect him to. But see, Habakkuk, you're not in a position to understand. You don't have the ultimate perspective to know what is really going on and what God is really doing. What you need to have is to trust that God understands and knows, and that he is sovereign. You know, that's what our faith in God is about. It's not God always doing what we expect him to do. It is God being sovereign and in control. And that his will be accomplished in all things. And so chapter 3 becomes a prayer. And at this point, Habakkuk's faith has been stretched. You know, at one point, it kind of would be great if we could get everyone's faith to stretch quite as easily, but maybe because Habakkuk's heart is so inclined toward God. And so chapter 3 is an expression of his wonder and his awe at God's majesty and his sovereignty. He is humbled before God. You know, and he says things like this, and I love this. I heard and my heart pounded, my lips quivered at the sound. You know, when was the last time that as we looked into God's word that we had such an emotionally powerful response to God and to what he says? To realize who he really is in the creation and the universe. And so in verse 16 he says, I will wait patiently for God. You know, that's part of the problems is we try to tell God what we want and how we expect him to be. You know my favorite thing about the guy that says, prayed, I want patience and I want it right now. You know, it's just, we're wanting something immediate. And we fail to understand that God's will is ultimate. And so Habakkuk expresses his resolve, and Tim read this. I can't read this too much. This is one of those passages that I have to keep going back to. And I have to keep thinking about as my expectations of what I think God should be doing, of sometimes how things are not working as we might hope. And what Habakkuk says here, though the fig tree does not bud, and there are no grapes on the vines, though the olive crop fails and the fields produce no food, though there are no sheep in the pen and no cattle in the stalls. You know, and just think about it. Look at these. Now, what he's saying is if everything seems to be going wrong the way that I expect or think it should, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in God, my Savior. The sovereign Lord is my strength. You know, we try to find our strength, our peace, our comfort in our circumstances. But think about it. Was Jesus' life composed of all these wonderful, peaceful, blissful circumstances with no problems, no difficulties? No, it wasn't. We would look at it from a human standpoint and say that about everything that could go wrong did go wrong for him. And so Habakkuk realizes that the sovereign Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer. He enables me to tread on the heights. You know, passages like that have a whole lot more meaning when you go to visit a place like Banff. And if you're driving through the mountains there and you watch the sheep and the goats on the mountains and you think, how can they possibly make it safely? You know, I kind of look down in the valleys, down below the cliffs where they're up grazing on these really steep precipices. And I tend to look down at the bottom to see how many bodies there are. and realize they're none. And that's the language that Habakkuk is using for God providing guidance and direction for his people. That he guides my feet. He leads me in his way. If I'm willing to listen and follow and trust. Tim's chosen a song for us to close with, Softly and Tenderly. You know, it's one of those traditional classic invitation songs, but it's designed to try to speak to our hearts. And maybe if you're here and you're not a Christian, we want to encourage you to really think about your relationship with God. Think about what you're trusting in your life. And if we can help you with that, we encourage you to talk with me, with Chad, one of the elders after. Or maybe as a Christian, you need one of the elders to pray with you. You can let that be known as well. Let's stand as we sing.